Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. You ever wonder after years and years and years of trying to come with some kind of diplomacy why the Middle East seems to be a powder keg and just going nuts? We just can't ever seem to figure out why can't these people just settle down and live in peace? Well, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a author of a new book called Shut Up, I'm Talking, and our guest joining us today is Gregory Levy. He was a bored 25-year-old law student living in New York City, so he applied for an internship at the Israeli mission in the United Nations and was instead hired as head speechwriter during one of the most turbulent times in Israeli history. And he's going to share with us today the experience of what it was like to work with these people, maybe give us some better insight about what the Middle East is all about, and hopefully maybe perhaps in that understanding we'll move toward a better solution towards seeking peace. And also we want to commemorate the fact that this year is the 60th anniversary of Israel as a state nation. So we'd like to welcome today on our program Gregory Levy, author of Shut Up, I'm Talking. Gregory, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, I can see why you'd want to kind of get out of learning law and try to find something a little bit different. Tell us about your experience as far as being a law student, because it seemed to me like, why would anybody want to do this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was clear from the get-go for me that law wasn't exactly suited for me, or I wasn't suited for it. I mean, I bear no ill will against those who chose differently, but I was in law school in New York and just, super bored. It just had become quickly clear that I didn't have the patience for it. So that's why I applied for this internship, and life took a strange turn.
Now, it's funny because as I was reading your book and you decided to apply for a job, that story was funny itself. And I think what's interesting is that the people should understand is that as you read, as you realize the process you went through just to get this particular job, you find it hilarious, but these people were really serious. And that's what makes it even funnier when you think of the contrast of the two. So tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I think you've got it right there. I was bored at law school. I figured I'd apply for an internship at the Israeli consulate. I also applied for one at the Canadian arts mission or something like that, and they just didn't return my call. But the Israelis also at first didn't return my call. But after a few weeks, I get this phone call from this sort of menacing individual. His voice is menacing. And he said, this is Yaron from Israeli Security. I need to ask you some questions. I was like, okay. I wasn't about to say no. And I started, answering basic questions. But he called back that same day, and he called back the next day, and the next day, and the next day for 2 weeks, asking very probing, intrusive questions to the point where it was almost absurd. I mean, he'd ask, what side of the street do you live on? Like, what side of the street do I live on? I don't understand this question. It's bizarre. Are you coming to visit me? It didn't make any sense. But each time I'd ask him, is this about the internship application? He'd say, I have no idea. I'm just doing security check. So I just sort of played along with these crazy, increasingly crazy questions. And eventually, they're asking me about my roommate and people back home and all kinds of stuff. Eventually, they say, okay, time for you to come in to the consulate, but we want you to come to the UN mission. I was like, okay, great. I got my internship. I go in there. I'm all excited, wearing a suit. I'm going to have an internship. I walk in, and I meet with the deputy ambassador to the UN. After, of course, a huge security ordeal just to get in the building. But he says to me, why are you here? I say, why am I here? I almost want to pull my hair out. I mean, it's been 2 weeks of dealing with this guy on the phone. Why am I here? I'm here for the internship. He said, we don't have internships. So I feel like I'm, on Candid Camera or something. And I said, well, yeah, why am I here then? He said, well, our deputy speechwriter's leaving, our deputy speechwriter left, our head speechwriter's leaving. Would you like to come on as a full-time speechwriter for the Israeli ambassador to the UN instead of as an intern? I thought I was hallucinating, but, I said yes, for better or worse. And, that's the story of how I got hired. And things just, progressively got more insane from then, as you know from looking at the book. Then they had, then it was time for a real security check. And they put me in this room after apparently checking on my friends and family with this security individual, the security guy, and this guy made the first guy seem like just casual small talk. He was asking me like what kind of liquor I drink. And I had this weird moment with him where I said, well, I like whiskey. And he's like, well, whiskey's very harsh. And he looks at me like I'm going to change my answer or something. I'm sorry, I don't know. And he'd ask me, about ex-girlfriends and tell me about your parents and just on and on and on. And how do you deal with stress? And I was just locked in this room for 2 hours getting this inquisition. And then they said, okay, now we're going to check if all you've told us is true. God knows how they checked. But, 6 weeks later, I was in the mission writing speeches for the ambassador to the UN, believe it or not.
Now, that's what's interesting because you're from Canada and you had a lot of schooling in Canada, Hebrew school I think you were talking about in your book, and so that seemed to be one of those key points too, is do you speak this language, and you seem to have sort of a rough understanding of doing it. But, in speech writing, typically when a person writes speeches, especially for political leaders, if you will, it's also having an understanding of that leader that's going to be delivering the speech, some insight. But it seemed to me like you were thrown into the chaos and you just kind of had to figure it all out yourself. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my Hebrew was atrocious. I mean, I sound like a 5-year-old, and maybe now I sound like a 6-year-old. But I certainly couldn't have written speeches in Hebrew. That would have been a new level of stupid. But I was writing speeches in English, even getting my orders in Hebrew sometimes. But you're absolutely right. When you write speeches, you have to cater it to whoever's speaking and for the occasion. So if you were to write a speech for a corporate event or for a commencement ceremony, you have to cater it to the moment. When you add in the extra elements of politics in the Middle East and writing for people who don't speak English as their first language in this powder keg of a region, it was completely intense. And I wasn't just thrown in totally. They sort of eased me in, but it was a pretty steep learning curve. It was pretty quick that I was in there writing these speeches, and I'd write something that was sort of conciliatory or North American in tone, Western, and I'd get sort of critiqued. We have to be harsher. You're not getting the fine points of the Middle East, and I just wasn't used to this sort of mindset, this hostile mindset. I mean, New York was somewhat hostile coming from Canada, but nothing compared to the Middle East attitude. So absolutely, just thrown in and had to learn.
I know one of the funny elements in your book is that, here you are, you're part of the UN now, you're part of the Israeli mission, and you've even got Canadian diplomats, a place that you live and grew up in, and they're trying to figure out, what are you doing here? Yeah, what are you doing in the Israeli mission of all things? And I think just knowing that element alone, it's like, so what were they intending to have someone like you in a position like that?
Right. Well, yeah. Well, also even the American diplomats I'd run into sometimes, and they'd say stuff like, so, did you just come here for this job? I'm like, no, I've been living in New York for a few years. I've been in law school, and I live nearby you. We'd find out, and they just didn't quite figure out how to place me. And like, didn't I meet you at like a softball game? Things like that. And then, and with the Canadians, yeah, it was even more sort of absurd, really, because I met them a couple times. Once was at a meeting between the Israelis and the Canadians. And the Israelis said, hey, this is Greg. He's actually from Canada. And the Canadians look at me very confused. What do you mean he's from Canada? And I barely spoke Hebrew. I was speaking in English all the time, really. And I'm speaking to the Canadians with, perfect Canadian accent. Who would have thought? And I say, I went to school there. You guys represent me. And they just don't know how to place me and how to figure out how I ended up in the Israeli mission. They say, well, you're an Israeli too, aren't you? I said, no, I'm just Canadian. Barely even been to Israel. So, yeah, that sort of fish out of water element confused everyone, me not least of all.
For those just tuning in, we're talking with Gregory Levy, and we're talking about his book, Shut Up, I'm Talking, where you'll hopefully get better insight of why the Middle East is the way it is now. We know, and it seems almost maddening, that when you take a look at the state of the Middle East, there's a lot of entitlement that's going on with the different groups, like the Israelis, the Palestinians, then you go to the Hebrews, the Christians, and it goes on and on. But there's a sense of entitlement and trying to claim what seems to be a relatively small area of the world, but seems to have the greatest amount of attention from the world itself. Now, as you were writing speeches and as you were being involved with meetings, what sort of insights can you share with our audience did you begin to see where you said, well, it is maddening, but I think I've got an understanding why these people, for lack of a better word, just kind of seem crazy?
Well, I think everyone in the Middle East does seem crazy. I mean, not just the Israelis by any means, everyone.
Right.
It's a crazy powder keg. And I guess, I mean, it's a maddening region. It's just so frustrating and so complex, and I can see why it drives people a little batty. And also the speed of events. You know, there's never time for planning or careful consideration. I mean, in likely the last 10 minutes since I've been talking to you, there's been some event in the Middle East, which may not make the American news, but will affect policy there. And it just moves that quickly. And you can see why it sort of drives you to this sort of frenzy. And, I mean, the essence of it is that you have a very, very small region desired by a lot of people, and with, you know, both or all have legitimate but conflicting claims. I mean, it's just a recipe for craziness.
That's what I meant by the entitlement factor. Is there's each one of them believe that, you know, they're entitled to that area, and so
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they both have they all have sort of reasonable arguments too, but conflicting arguments. So it's a disaster. I would say waited to happen, but no, it's happening now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, what would you most like people to understand so they can go, okay, I get it now, about your experience when you were working with the Israelis and the Palestinians, and you were writing speeches and understanding their politics and how they actually try to get anything done if they do?
Yeah. Well, I don't really have a sort of a message or agenda, but I think if I got anything from this, and I would hope if people read my book, they'd get something, this sort of similar thing from it. Two things. One is that we think of this as sort of this, you know, life and death, and it is, but a dark struggle with these epic proportions, but at the heart of it, there's just people. You know, and people are fallible, and people are always doing silly things, and those people are no different on both sides and all sides, and they're just sort of fumbling their way through half the time a very tricky situation. But these are people with the regular problems. Anyone you might meet in the grocery store, and people don't realize that often. You think of these conflicting ideologies, or you think of the sinister Zionist machine, or the sinister terrorist Palestinians or something. But it's just people on both sides sort of fumbling their way through a terrible predicament. And the other thing is the improvisational nature. I mean, even me just, I applied for an internship and ended up at the UN mission, and a year and a half later ended up writing speeches in Jerusalem for the Prime Minister. I think it's a bit telling that things just work in an improvised, impromptu, sort of off-the-cuff manner just because of the speed of events. And if things seem crazy from afar, that's probably the reason.
Now, on the receiving end of American journalism, how do you think they may be interpreted or misinterpreted as far as how we receive the news about the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we get it in sort of black and white, broad strokes, and depending on your news outlet, you either get right wing or left wing, or even the reasonable centrist outlook is still sort of broad strokes. And if you look at the Arab world's media, it's obviously hugely anti-Israel. But if you look at other sort of right-wing Israeli media, it's also just in these simple characterizations. But I think in the end, it's so much more complex. I mean, I came to understand it, that I'd be writing speeches which were pushing government policy, and it seemed like very reasonable government policy, but then suddenly I'd get torpedoed because of an extremist viewpoint that was, the Prime Minister had to take into account. Even though he didn't believe in it, or the government didn't believe in it, there'd be sort of a subgroup fighting this group. And the Israelis are it's a very fractured society with all these different interests pulling at it. And the same would definitely go for the Palestinians. West Bank Palestinians and Gaza Palestinians, totally different right now. And there's all kinds of different sects and sectors in Palestinian society. So I think we get these large, broad strokes, but I think it's just way more complex than anyone sort of paints it.
Well, that's just it, because I listen to people sometimes as we talk or discuss about the Middle East, and I simply just say, well, where do you get your information from? Well, I've seen it in the news or I heard it from somebody, and so they take that as fact, and I think to myself, well, you really have to be in the culture to have a better understanding of who these people are and how they work. For instance, If you're in Japan and you meet someone, you don't put your hand out and shake them because Asians actually just don't like to be touched. That's sort of like you're breaking their space, so to speak. So you wouldn't understand that. Or, for instance, let's say you're in South America and you want to date somebody's daughter. Well, you got to sit with the family for a good, reasonable amount of time before they give you permission to leave. But yet on the receiving end, as we were just talking about through the news and the media, they sort of paint it, well, these people are sort of like us. They have kids, they date, they marry, they go to jobs, and then this is their policies and politics. But you have to realize just how far back that really goes as far as how they interact and understand or even tolerate each other, even if they do that. And so you wonder if there's ever going to be an end in sight toward peace, or if they just really enjoy being that way. What was your experience?
Well, I don't think anyone enjoys it. There's no one who's enjoying it. That's the one thing I disagree with. But everything else you said, yeah, absolutely. I think a large part of the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians is exactly this, like a cultural rift. And then within Israeli society, you have all kinds of cultural rifts. You have 1 million plus Russian speakers who just arrived from Russia in the last decade or so. You have Arab Israelis. You have the religious, the secular, and they've all got these rifts. And then certainly, from our perspective, trying to understand it, and my perspective in this book, I completely, the book's really, my book is about culture clash. I come there sort of expecting things to work as I imagine they would work in, the White House or Canadian government or British government, but it's totally different. I mean, this informal and impromptu way things work, it's bizarre to me, and to me seemed totally counterproductive and bad. And I still think it is half the time, but at the same time, I know I'm bringing with me my sort of North American sensibilities. And I agree with you. You got to be immersed in it to have any chance of understanding it. Though, to be honest, after being immersed in it for a few years, I feel I understand it less.
And, yeah, I can see where you started to go crazy enough that you actually tried to wing your high school French translation of an Arab diplomat's anti-Israel remarks. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so just shortly after I got there, must have been
just the idea of French and Israel. I mean, how you even bridged that one, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Well, just, about 6 weeks after I got there, I get this phone call that I'm supposed to go to the senior diplomat's office, which was kind of weird because I was still shadowing the speechwriter at the time, so I don't know why I was being called in. But I go in, and he's all excited about something, like urgent. And he says, "You speak French, right?" And I think, oh, my God, I told him I speak French. I grew up in Canada. You have to take French classes. But no, I definitely don't speak French. I speak horrible French, worse even than my Hebrew. But I'd put on my CV that I had, some French ability. I didn't lie and say I was fluent. But I didn't think, as you said, like, why would it come up? I'm working for the Israeli government in New York City. Why is French going to be an issue? Well, it was. He says to me, we got this anti-Israel remark sent from Paris said by a UN diplomat speaking French. We need you to translate it right away so we can write a response. And I just sort of take this paper. I mean, when he asked me, "You speak French, right?" I wanted to say, well, as long as you have nothing else for me to do or say, yeah, I speak great French. But as I take this paper and leave the room, I think, oh, my God, I don't speak French at all. And this is political and legal French. It's not,
right.
fifth grade French, Bob meets Sue or something. And so I walk into my office basically hyperventilating. What in God's name am I going to do? And I figure, well, I went on this two dates with this girl. I think she said she spoke French. So I called her up, and I couldn't reach her. I mean, I'm just grasping at straws here. And I'm calling up, like, friends who I think might know a bit of French. I can't get anyone. And I went on to one of those, those online translations.
Okay.
And using that in my very broken elementary school French, I tried to piece together this high-level diplomacy thing, and I did it. And I handed it in and just sort of hoped that I wouldn't hear anything more about it. But within a couple hours, Reuters and AP picked it up. The next day, the New York Times and the Washington Post was using my translation. I was hiding under my desk. I wanted to run away, which I think was something I felt a lot of times during this whole experience. Was you just better run away. But luckily, I'm very relieved to report that the translation. Although I'm sure I made this guy sound like he was had some speech problem. The substance was correct, so I dodged the bullet somehow on that one. Which
now,
I think
if I remember right, didn't it have something to do, or at least originally, I think it was a comic pun, but you were talking about bad fish. Is that what it was?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So this was an added level of anxiety for me. After I'd sent it in or handed it in and walked back to my office hoping I'd never hear anything about this again, I suddenly think, wait a minute. According to my translation, I had that guy saying, quote, Israel is the great poison in the region, which is a very, acerbic negative statement, great poison.
Right.
But then I start thinking, hold on. In French, the translation of fish is poisson. Did he maybe say Israel is just the big fish in the region? And I think, this could be a disaster. I'm setting up an international incident, and for the next few hours, I'm trying to figure out what he said, and I'm very. Oh, and then the Secretary General spokesperson, after my translation was released, made a statement that said we never use the word poison. And I think, oh my God, I'm going to be put in jail by Israeli security, or at very least fired. And luckily, though, he was just referring to his own office, and the guy had said poison. I was the only guy in the world who was relieved that this guy had said poison.
I know, it's just funny to read through the book, Shut Up, I'm Talking. Mainly, as I was saying in the beginning of the program, is the fact that you realize these people are serious, they mean well, but you can't stop thinking this is ridiculous sometimes. Now, there was a particular incident that I found kind of funny, especially with this big Democratic nomination race that's going on between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and you literally almost ran into her. Tell us about that, because what I got a kick about is what you thought about her without knowing who it was at first.
Absolutely. I think, you said that these people, they're doing their best, and that's true. And since this book's come out, a couple people who've worked in other governments or in the past, had emailed me or talked to me and said, it's not so different in the American government or the Canadian. I think the government, giant bureaucracies, I think in many ways that's all I was experiencing. And I never worked in another government, but this one certainly seemed silly. After a major vote, or major discussion at the UN anyway, there was going to be a joint press conference with a particular U.S. senator and the Israeli ambassador. And so I have my little tag which says, I'm not a threat. Basically, it says I'm a diplomat, which was also odd because I was not really a diplomat. But when I heard about that at first, I thought, okay, I'm gonna be parking anywhere I want. I'm gonna have all this immunity. I didn't have a car, but diplomatic immunity I figured would be great. Anyway, I'm running across the street, First Avenue in New York, and there's the little area where the press conference is happening. And I see U.S. diplomatic security and also U.S. The Secret Service. But they let me through because I have my tag. They just sort of move aside, and I'm running, and then suddenly screeching to a halt because I see in front of me I'm about to smash into someone, and I'm about to smash into this woman. And then, I wrote in the book. I don't know why I wrote it or even thought it. I thought, wow, this woman has a huge head. This woman I'm about to smash into has a huge head, and just like a millisecond before, I would have knocked her over. I realized, oh my God, this woman with the huge head who I'm about to smash into is Hillary Clinton. So I don't even know what would have happened if I had it. And I actually did bump into her just very lightly, but I can't imagine. I would have been shot by the Secret Service or something if I'd run into her full force. So that was yet another bullet, so to speak, that I dodged. But that was my one little experience with Senator Clinton.
I know, just as I was saying, as people read this book, I think they'll really enjoy a clearer understanding of why things, I guess, are the way they are. They may not be good. We want to move toward peace. That hopefully is a possibility, so we can all just settle down. But when you take a look at leaders such as Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert, you think to yourself of Steve Irwin, the animal propaganda. But here I remember seeing an episode. He's holding a black mamba by his tail. Right. Literally by his tail. He's holding it out in front of him, and he's kind of spread-legged, and I'm thinking to myself, it'd be funny to go up with a mirror, put it in front of him so he could see himself and say, now this makes sense to you? And I'm sure that's probably what you felt a lot of times as you were even dealing with these particular political leaders.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy, I gotta say.
Well, just, say, and this makes sense to you.
Right.
You can almost hear Seinfeld in the background. This makes sense to you? So anyway.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, the UN mission was one thing, but a year and a half after I got there, Prime Minister Sharon came to New York, and he, I did some consulting work on a speech for him, and a week later I get a phone call. We'd like you to move to Israel to be the Prime Minister's English speechwriter. I'm like, what? And I flew up and I did it. I landed there on the day they were disengaging from Gaza. But the whole thing, and I was there for about a year. The whole thing was that made the UN mission look orderly and like it made sense. Suddenly I was in the Prime Minister's office, and yeah, exactly. I wanted to say the whole time, and this made sense to you? Absolutely, because things were just. I mean, the UN mission had some semblance of normalcy, but the Prime Minister's office was, total chaos, and I'd see the weirdest stuff there. And to be honest, after a while, I just sort of got caught up in it. You bring up Seinfeld. I'm sort of glad. I knew it was time for me to stop. I mean, to begin with, all I wanted was an internship. I knew it was time for me to stop.
And there you were in the middle of almost a political process as a Canadian for Israel.
Yeah, I'm right there. Well, I'm working, like I'm in Sharon's office every day, and I knew it was sort of time to get out when the insanity of it all was getting to me to the point where I actually started secretly putting Seinfeld references. You brought up Seinfeld into the Prime Minister of Israel's speeches. Because I figured, like, everyone else is so wacky, why not just join in? And I started putting in Seinfeld. I mean, at that point I realized, you know what, you have no business being here, and it's time to leave. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole book and the whole experience, I just think this makes sense. And I think it might even be worse on the Palestinian side. I just think the whole region's just full of insanity.
Now, I just have to ask you, what was the pay like for a job like this?
Oh, it was quite terrible. I gotta say, it was abysmal. Yeah, no, they don't pay well. I mean, there's some weird perks, like the diplomatic immunity and stuff, which I didn't really use. I didn't do any crimes, but there was other strange perks like duty-free liquor at all times, or duty-free anything at all times, because I was technically a diplomat, which made no sense because I lived down the street. But no, the pay, nothing to write home about. That's for sure.
That's funny. That's what I was kind of curious. What were as you were sharing some of them in the book, were some of the perks that you get? It isn't free medical and dinner, as you said. It was duty-free liquor.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some other even weirder things. I don't know if you know what. I'm sure you know what matzah is. The flatbread.
Okay. Yeah.
Have on Passover. So once a year. I guess, this is how it was explained to me. Once a year, everyone in the Israeli government, as a bonus, their bonus is 2 pieces of that matzah. And they call it a bonus. And, this is one thing if you're in, like, the mission in, like, Nairobi or something, obviously, and you want to celebrate Passover, fine. But I was living in New York City. You couldn't escape matzah. And instead, they gave me 2 pieces of matzah one day. This is my bonus. I'm like, this is my bonus? How about $50? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like, or tickets to a movie. I mean, I got these giant crackers.
Yeah, it is funny sometimes. You never know when you step out the door sometimes when you decide to take a particular offer, the adventure that it's going to take you into, but I'm sure that you're glad you were able to step out of it. But as you did and as you wrote this book and as you've been able to talk with people in the media or actually people in general on any sort of a book tour that you may have been on, what has been the common reaction to people as far as their understanding of your experience and how you share that experience with other people?
Good question. I mean, people laugh, which I'm glad, because that's really all I'm setting out to do. But they ask the question like, "Oh my God, we're all doomed. Are we all doomed? Like, if this is how things run, are we all doomed?" And my answer is no. In a way, it's sort of reassuring because like I said, what I learned is at the center of this, the people with their hands on the button or controlling war and stuff, they're just people and humans with human foibles, and in a way, that's a bit scary. Obviously, because, I certainly wouldn't want to be the guy with my finger on the button, but at the same time, I think it's a bit reassuring that they're people with the same needs and desires and goals as anyone else, and they're humans, weird humans, but I think all humans are weird, so I think that's been, in many ways, a central theme of the tour I've been doing and the conversations I've been having.
Now, Gregory, just from your experience, applying common sense if it is possible in the situation that you were in.
Not sure. Yeah.
What would you say would be the best way for these people to move toward peace?
Yeah, that's I wish I could answer that properly. I've got a description of my own little story in this. To have a prescription of what to suggest, I don't know. The one thing that, if to get serious for a minute, the one thing that really bothered me was that, in theory, this should be a political conflict. And on both the Palestinian and Israeli side, you have people who see it that way. And although it's a difficult political conflict to solve, all political conflicts are, in theory, able to be solved. What I'm worried about is it's becoming more and more, and maybe we've even passed the turning point, a religious conflict.
Right.
And as soon as it's a religious conflict, I just don't see any way to solve it. I mean, you can negotiate politics and, rights of a people and diplomacy, but how do you negotiate religion? You both claim you have, a particular holy site is God gave to you, and how do you resolve that? You can't.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be a political conflict. 30, 40 years ago, it was. But both sides, I think, have become a bit more religion-focused, and religion is sort of hijacking it. Extremist religion, obviously, not
right.
sort of day-to-day religion. And I just think the more that happens, and it's happening more and more, so the longer it takes for this conflict to be solved, the more that will overwhelm it, and the less chance I think there ever will be to solve it, which I think is just tragic, because most of the people on both sides really just want normal two-state solution with peace and security, but then you have these religious extremists on both sides hijacking it.
Yeah, it's just like you said, you throw the human element into anything, and perfection turns to imperfection in its own perfect way. It's kind of interesting that way. Again, the book is "Shut Up, I'm Talking," and our guest who's been with us today on the Beyond 50 radio program has been Gregory Levy. And Gregory, we'd like to thank you for sharing with us today this interesting story and experience that you definitely had. So what are you doing these days?
Well, thanks very much for having me. These days, I'm sort of just trying to get the word out about this book and trying to think of another book to write. If you have any suggestions, let me know. It won't be on the Middle East. I think I had more than enough of that. So.
Well, again, Gregory, thank you for joining us here on the program
today. Thank
you. You bet. I'm Daniel Davis, and we want to thank you out there for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. You want to find out more about us, just log on to our website at beyond50radio.com. That is 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. And also check out this book. It's actually a very entertaining read and gives you some real interesting insight, again, as to how these people are, how they think, and how they work. Again, the book is Shut Up, I'm Talking, and the author, Gregory Levy. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.